Welcome to Discovering the Wellness Formula. I'm Ashley Glantz.
And I'm Dustin Messick, and we are both registered dietitian nutritionists. We're here to promote wellness through the lens of nutrition and so much more, helping you navigate the journey by bridging the gap between reliable information and misinformation.
Together, we'll provide you with a clear blueprint of knowledge and actionable steps to support your health and well-being.
And here's our disclaimer. The information provided on this podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified healthcare provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition or health concerns.
Our podcast, Discovering the Wellness Formula, dives into all domains of health, whether it's discussing mental health strategies, nutrition tips, fitness approaches, or exploring how relationships and personal growth contribute to our overall well-being. We aim to make wellness more accessible and inclusive for everyone.
Welcome, everyone. This is Discovering the Wellness Formula. So today we have a special guest with us named Kaczor, who is a registered dietitian specializing in eating disorders, mental health, and substance use disorder. She has completed advanced training to become a certified eating disorder specialist and a certified intuitive eating counselor. Throughout her career, she has worked hard to expand access to care for those in need and has been highly involved in the development of new treatment programs to provide this care. She is known for her out-of-box thinking and never give up spirit. She believes everyone deserves to have complete peace with food and helps clients make food fun again. And for our listeners who are registered dietitians, if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out a CEU presentation by Kate on hormones and eating disorders. The link is included in the episode description. Hi, Kate.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here and be able to talk to you guys today.
Yeah, likewise. So what inspired you to specialize in eating disorders and mental health within the dietetics? How has this approach evolved over the years?
Yeah, good question. So when I was studying to become a dietitian, I initially really wanted to go into diabetes care. So when I was a kid, I really loved just making lists of everything and wanted to make different meal plans. And in diabetes care at the time, there was a lot of like using exchanges, and it was just kind of fun to mix and match things. So I really wanted to do that. But then everyone in my class also wanted to do diabetes. And I was like, I don't know if I want to do the same thing as everyone else. And as part of our programming, I had to spend some time with different dietitians from different areas of practice. And I got paired with a dietitian who had an eating disorder private practice. And so I got to do that for a little while. And I found that, it was just a whole new ball game of really being able to dig deep with someone's relationship with food and kind of see that big change over time. So what I was finding in some of my other learnings and exposures was that you would go in, you would talk to someone, you'd give them a plan, and you'd never see what happened to them again, or they weren't really even in the place to hear that information because maybe they were, really sick, or they were dealing with really severe issues with their medication, or had just been in a severe accident. And, you just really weren't able to do that deeper work. So when I found that, hey, I could actually work on someone's relationship with food, I really wanted to tap into that. And I quickly found that from doing that work with eating disorders, a lot of the other health conditions that I had been looking at from a nutrition perspective were really influenced by disordered eating as well. And so I felt like if I could tap into that, I'd be able to, kind of reach people with a lot of different health conditions. Over the years, that's continued to evolve. We're learning so many things about how to approach someone with an eating disorder or with a mental health condition. It used to be like, let's just make people gain weight really fast, get them up to a healthy level. And now we know that that just sets people up for relapse. We've got to do that deeper work and changing the thinking behind our food choices and really doing that relational piece too, to help people feel connected and, like they have a sense of purpose. So it's been a lot of development there, but it's really been a really cool journey.
I love that. That is so beautiful. I actually also, when I was in my internship, interned for a private practice eating disorder dietitian, and that's how I got into the field of eating disorders as well. So we definitely have that parallel. I think it's so incredible too. You talked about like kind of the evolution, about how when starting, it was more about like the weight gain, but not talking about the like co-occurring maybe mental health that was going on with it, et cetera. So for you to be able to see that, how long have you been in the field?
Yeah, so I've dedicated the majority of my career to working with this population. And so I've been doing that for about 11 years now.
And through the span of your career, I've heard through the grapevine that you've played a key role in opening several new treatment centers. Tell us a little bit about that.
During different points in my career, I've had the opportunity to work on both opening new facilities as well as kind of developing programming within those. I've worked to open a lot of different residential and day program treatment options for individuals with eating disorders. And for those of you who aren't super familiar with that lingo, residential facility is where someone goes, they're living there 24/7. They've got specialized support from nursing staff and therapists and psychiatrists and dietitians. And then there's also like support staff on the floor that help with day-to-day activities. You've got groups and sessions and meal support. It's kind of a step down from being in the hospital where someone might need a lot of medical monitoring. And a day program, which is sometimes also called a partial hospitalization program, they're going there for several hours during the day, probably on average like 8 hours a day. Then they'll go home in the evening or to housing that might be provided by the program, like an apartment. And so when I entered the field, there were only a handful of really developed treatment centers. And now, depending on where you are in the country, there's loads of options to pick from. Still areas where they're underserved, but kind of my role was getting some of those up and running. And I did a lot of work in some of the facilities on developing specialized programs for individuals with binge eating disorder. Because despite binge eating disorder actually being the most prevalent type of eating disorder, we have the least type of programming available. And there tends to be a lack of awareness about that eating disorder in general. And a lot of times clients might feel uncomfortable going into a treatment program where everyone is in a much smaller body than them or is struggling with restricting and fearing binging. To be able to go in and talk about those struggles openly and vulnerably can be quite difficult. So opening some program tracks for that has been really cool. And I also was highly involved in developing a program for diabetes and eating disorders. So I got to kind of tap into that diabetes love, which is really awesome. So I did some work, creating treatment protocols and developing programming for those individuals, which is a really, really big need, because if we think about all of the different things that someone needs to pay attention to monitor when they have diabetes, they have to think about food all day long. And there's loads of weight stigma that goes along with diabetes. So being able to provide a safe place for those struggling with that is a great opportunity, because it really does take a lot of careful planning and attention. Someone who's struggling with that combination of illnesses, you can't just go anywhere. Like, someone does need to be really trained, because it can be quite complicated to, work through getting the insulin back on track if someone is using that and refeeding in a safe way. So that's been an area I focused on as well. And then in some of the different mental health facilities and substance use programs that I've worked in, really developing more awareness with the staff around disordered eating, because there is so much crossover that happens with those different conditions. And it can be a lot of whack-a-mole. For example, when someone gets sober, there's a strong crossover to then becoming really preoccupied with food or becoming really preoccupied with exercise and starting to notice those warning signs and being able to create better balance. Because when those things get off track, the person is a lot higher risk of, eventually going back into relapsing into their addiction. And so putting some of those things in place has been an important part as well.
That's huge. I think when I was working in treatment for eating disorders, one of the things that I learned really quickly was the co-occurring piece that you were mentioning, like individuals with eating disorders with co-occurring mental health, but also substance abuse. And I didn't realize there was so much overlap. And we would have clients that were jumping around maybe from eating disorder, and then they would jump into like a substance program, and then they would jump into a mental health program. And I was like, wait, we need something that like does all three, because I could see there was like a huge gap in care. And I was like, oh my gosh, these people need support in all three areas. Because when they were in substance treatment, they weren't getting help for their eating disorder. When they were in the eating disorder, they weren't getting help for their substance. You know what I mean? Like they were like almost falling through the cracks, it felt like. And so for you to be able to obviously support those individuals is huge. What would you say has been like one of the biggest challenges you have faced, whether opening a new treatment center or just working in that setting?
Yeah, there's definitely always kind of ups and downs. I think it is just navigating the complexities of the care of these individuals, because what we can find is because all of those different things tend to occur at once, you might think, okay, we're on this good path, and then something pops up over here and like, oh shoot, we're kind of back to square one. And it can kind of feel like you're going in circles, and it can feel that way for the clients as well. And then you kind of add the other layer of, most people can't be in treatment for forever, and we wouldn't want that anyway. They've got to get back to their lives. They might have children at home they need to care for. They might have financial responsibilities they need to tend to. Then we have the insurance component that isn't going to want to continue paying if we're going in these circles. And so just being really stuck in that sometimes. I think that's why it's really important to be addressing things from all angles. So that way you're less likely to be in that teetering back and forth and kind of having to start over at square one. There's only so much that can be done in different treatment facilities. And so, say someone was struggling with alcohol, if they were in an eating disorder treatment facility and they were on a pass and they drank alcohol, they would most likely be discharged from that care. It's quite black and white. And sometimes that has to be done for safety reasons of the other individuals in the program. But yeah, then that person is kind of left hanging. And so you definitely feel for the situation, because there's really nothing you can do except for try to make sure that person, gets put with the right resources to address what they need to in that moment. And so, yeah, I think one of the hardest things is just kind of figuring out how to provide those services when it does feel like things are just bouncing around and you've got this limited time, and, there's kind of pressure from all angles, which just kind of increases the stress of the person and makes them more likely to, struggle with their eating as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's kind of like triaging, right? You have to like see like which issue's the biggest that we need to address right away. So I think that's a really great point. And with all great challenges, obviously come beautiful learning lessons. So what have you learned, do you think, from your experiences over the last 11 years?
I think the biggest thing that I've learned is that people don't get better on a protocol. You've got to really look at the whole person and figure out what is their unique story. And that's going to look so different from everyone. But I think, just for like efficiency's sake and, organization, have something in it like a report. We often have these protocols that we try to fit everyone into. And there might be slight differences within those that we try to personalize, but it kind of all comes back to this checkbox game. We know that despite significant research that has been happening in the eating disorder world and more providers coming into the space, our recovery outcomes are still dismal. We have clients coming to treatment over and over and over again, year after year. And, some studies are showing that less than 50% of people are making a full recovery. It's taking far too long. And I think that's because we get so stuck in doing the same things over and over again and expecting a different result. I think as we just look at people's relationship with food in general, like even outside of the eating disorder, that's going to look different for everyone. We factor in cultural beliefs, family dynamics, socioeconomics, scheduling, food preferences. We can't expect that everyone with an eating disorder is going to have the same relationship with food, but yet we kind of try to force them into that. So I think my biggest learning has been really listening to what's going on for a person. And you have to take that with a bit of a grain of salt and recognize that, someone with an eating disorder is, suffering from a level of malnutrition, and that's impacting their cognitions and how they see the world. But that doesn't mean that nothing that they say is useful and that everything is from the eating disorder. And so really developing that relationship so you can figure out, what is that person's genuine values? What do they want their recovery to look like? And helping them achieve that. And they might find that shifts for them over time. Like someone might come into treatment and tell me, okay, my goal is that I want to just be able to eat these really safe foods, but stay out of the hospital. That might be very different than someone else who is like, actually, I want to be able to eat all these foods freely with my family and never have any anxieties about food again. I think kind of meeting them where they're at. Because if you try to put them on a different playing field, you're going to lose them. You might find that person A kind of shifts into being person B as they heal, but you'll never get them there if you're trying to just assume that's where they want to be.
What are the things people should look for in choosing the best eating disorder treatment facility? This is a big one, I feel.
Yeah. So as I mentioned before, nowadays there are loads of treatment facilities out there, a number of different options that most people can pick from. Kind of the first thing that a person needs to do is figuring out with their insurance plan what is covered. And usually if you were to phone a treatment facility, they're pretty good about doing insurance checks for you. That can kind of be an initial hurdle of just figuring out what your plan covers, because sometimes plans are only going to cover within your state, and sometimes they'll cover throughout the country. It just kind of depends. And then kind of looking at the in-network benefits versus out-of-network benefits, because generally the in-network is going to be a bit more affordable. If we get kind of past those initial criteria, I think it's like doing an assessment of yourself and what you need. So for example, if you know that you're a person who has co-occurring medical issues, whether that be, we've gone through refeeding before and you always get refeeding syndrome, or you have co-occurring gastroparesis or diabetes or a cardiac issue, you're going to want to go somewhere that has a strong medical program, because otherwise you're setting yourself up for being sent to the hospital all the time, or that just being a big distraction from your care. And so looking at the different programs out there and seeing who has 24/7 nursing, how many doctors are on staff, how often are you going to see those doctors? I'm really asking those questions from the medical or from the admissions department. For some people, that's not going to be a big piece of their treatment, and that might not be a factor when they're considering. Some other things to think about are, can you go on the website and find the staff who are working there? And does it say anything about how long they've worked there? You can always call up and try to ask to speak with people on site. I think that's always a great thing to do, so you can kind of get a feel for, what their style is. Like, do you feel like you kind of connect with them on the phone? So I always encourage people to do that, so that way you've got that kind of familiar voice and you kind of know what you're getting into. Knowing that if you've had therapy before and there's certain types of therapeutic modalities that you really connect with, or ones that maybe really don't. Different treatment centers tend to lean towards different types of therapies. Generally, most places are going to have a combination, but there's oftentimes one that's like more of the focus, whether that be dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, or some places are more into internal family systems, which is kind of like a parts work. So if you know within yourself that certain types of therapies work well, trying to find a treatment center that aligns with that. And then you're going to want to think about if things like the people that you're going to be with makes a difference to you. Sometimes the group in the house at the time might be a completely different demographic. And sometimes there's a lot of benefit of that, but sometimes it can create a bit of barriers, especially in group settings. So if, you're much older or much younger, then sometimes that can make it a bit tricky. So if that's something that's important to you, asking the admissions team about that. trying to figure out, if there's things that are important that you want to be able to maintain doing while you're in treatment, like taking classes online, or if there's things you need to do for work, what are the allowances for that, and what are the reasons behind that? A lot of times people do need to take complete breaks just to heal. There are certain situations where maybe that's not possible, and certain treatment facilities might have more ability to be flexible around making accommodations, and others might be stricter about those things. And so being able to have that awareness before going in as well. I think it's also can be really helpful to try to talk to one of the dietitians at the facility and get a bit of awareness around what is the meal setup going to look like, and what sort of practical skills will you get. Sometimes treatment facilities are just more, okay, this is your food, we need to focus on completing it. And in other programs, it's like from the beginning, you're picking out what you want to have, you're doing a lot of cooking, you're doing a lot of meal outings, stuff like that. And so I think, again, trying to assess for yourself, do you know, hey, I just need to focus on eating. I'm going to be too overwhelmed to do anything else at this point. And I know that creates a distraction for me. Or do I find that I really need those life skills and I need to be practicing that as early on as possible. I think it's knowing that, every program is going to have its ups and downs and pros and cons. But I think the more information you can have going in, and the more connection you can have with the facility, the better informed you can be if it's the right fit for what you need at that time.
Yeah, definitely love that you just provided us with like a comprehensive list. I think for a lot of us, going into treatment is super scary. It's something that could take people months, if not years, to decide to like jump into. And so like really to find the program that works best for you is going to be key. And so many different programs have different philosophies. So really being aware of that program's philosophies. I know a lot of programs, some of them believe you can be fully recovered, others don't. You want to make sure that that kind of aligns with your core values as well. So I really love that you hit on that. Also, earlier you mentioned co-occurring medical conditions. I really want to kind of touch on that a little bit more. Before I got into the world of eating disorders, I didn't realize how eating disorders impacted our bodies. You mentioned gastroparesis, cardiovascular issues. Could you just kind of expand on that just a little bit more for our listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. So when someone is suffering from an eating disorder, and that can be any type of eating disorder, a restrictive one, some loss of control eating, or any binging and purging, or overexercise, it is damaging every single cell in the body. Even if that person doesn't have any weight loss, that can create some pretty significant medical complications. And so one of the most significant is those cardiovascular issues. And it's one of the largest causes of death of someone with an eating disorder is that sudden cardiac arrest. And that can be a result of muscle loss. So our heart is a muscle. And so when we have malnutrition, or our body is being under significant stress from other eating disorder behaviors, it breaks down. And then when someone is engaging in any purging type behavior, so vomiting, laxatives, there are significant electrolyte shifts, which can also throw off the cardiac rhythms and make someone at high risk of that cardiac failure. And then everything in the digestive tract slows down. It is not getting the proper stream of fuel going through. And so people tend to end up with a really sluggish gut. So they end up feeling like their food is just sitting there. It's kind of like bricks. Sometimes it's coming back up their esophagus. They need to re-swallow it. There's a lot of constipation, or sometimes people don't absorb their food very well and end up having diarrhea. And then beyond that, we've got because of not having enough nutrients in the body, especially not getting enough fats, people tend to have hair loss. They are going to have brittle nails. They tend to, if their body is struggling to stay warm, they might grow this fine little hair all throughout their body. And a lot of times temperature regulation is really poor, where the circulation is just not going through the body. There's not enough fuel for that. And so people tend to be really cold, or sometimes they end up being overheated as well. And they just can't keep that temperature regulation very, very smoothly. And then we also have concerns around bone health. And so even if someone has been restricting for a short period of time, say 6 months or so, they're already starting to experience diminished bone mineral density, which can lead to conditions like osteoporosis, which we often don't think about until someone's in their like 70s or 80s. But that's what the bones of people with eating disorders can sometimes look like, because it's not a priority of life, keeping those bones strong, and the body's going to try to leach out whatever it can to try to use that for energy. And then we have reproductive function as well, tends to completely shut off because it's just not a safe environment for someone to be creating new life when they're barely keeping their life intact. So it really can kind of hit from all different angles. One thing to keep in mind, though, is the body is quite resilient and everyone is going to respond to things differently. So if you're listening to this right now and you're wondering if you have an eating disorder and you have none of the things I just said, that doesn't mean you don't have an eating disorder. It often is a bit of Russian roulette, where someone might have absolutely no symptoms at all whatsoever, and then all of a sudden everything starts to decline. And you never know when that's going to be, because the body is always at risk for that. But there is definitely this kind of stigma of, well, if I'm not requiring, significant medical treatment, if I'm not having this long list of symptoms, if there's nothing off with my labs, then there's no way I have an eating disorder. And that's just not true, and it is just kind of like a ticking time bomb when eventually those organs are going to start to break down.
I think that's so important that you mentioned that, because I had a lot of clients when I was working in residential that would have like perfect labs, quote unquote, but we knew they were engaging in behavior for years, right? But then we would suddenly like see a shift. But also mentioning that I've had clients that would come in with not great labs, weren't doing well. And then when their labs would start to improve, they were like, I'm cured, I'm done, I can leave, So like also knowing like, hey, those aren't necessarily like indicators, because you were mentioning earlier, right? It's a whole holistic approach, right? We want to like address the underlying psychological issues as well. So I think that's huge that you just hit on that. For some of our listeners, we may have heard the term eating disorders, but also disordered eating. So I would love for you to kind of dive a little bit into what that difference is.
Yeah, absolutely. So eating disorders are diagnosed through criteria that's listed out in this manual called the DSM-5. And there's very specific criteria that goes into the diagnoses of different conditions. So we've got anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorder, ARFID, which is avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. And then there's some other smaller ones that we won't go into today, but there's specific criteria. So for example, for someone to be diagnosed with anorexia nervosa, they need to be restricting their energy intake relative to what the requirements might be for someone of that age and height. And it's leading to a significantly low body weight in kind of the context of their age and development. And then there's also this intense fear of weight gain or becoming fat, and then engaging in behaviors that try to prevent that weight gain from happening. And then disturbance with body image, despite being at a low weight. And there's different subsets. Some is focused more on restricting, and some is on binging and purging behaviors. And then there's a level of severity that's kind of based off of BMI, which is problematic for all sorts of reasons that I won't get into right this second. But you would need to meet those criteria in order to be diagnosed with anorexia nervosa. There's been some changes in the DSM criteria over the years, and they've added some new diagnoses that makes it a lot easier for people to be diagnosed with eating disorders. So for example, we have a diagnosis called OSFED, and that stands for Other Specified Feeding and Eating Disorders. And that allows for people who they're really struggling with their relationship with food, but they might not meet every single checkbox on the list of different behaviors. And so, maybe they are struggling with bulimia, but they don't engage in binging and purging behaviors as frequently as the diagnosis says. And so those people still have a diagnosable eating disorder. They just don't fit neatly into boxes. So I think that that's been a good addition. And then sometimes clients might be diagnosed with unspecified feeding or eating disorders. And that's where we know that their eating is really, really causing distress in their life, but again, they don't fit neatly into one of the other types of eating disorders. And it might be a very different presentation, but it's still causing a lot of issues within their life. And if we kind of compare that to disordered eating, it's quite a spectrum. So disordered eating could be as simple as feeling guilty for eating some chocolate. And it could go as extreme as like limiting yourself of certain types of food and having, some preoccupation with food, feeling a bit out of control with eating at times. But kind of the hallmark of what makes it an eating disorder is that it's interfering with your ability to function in the world. And it's causing a level of distress that doesn't feel manageable. Someone with disordered eating would still benefit from getting support and from talking with a therapist, talking with a dietitian, because once you're in that spectrum, it's very easy to move throughout that spectrum. And kind of getting ahead of the eating disorder and having that preventative care is super duper important, because once you're in the throes of an eating disorder, it becomes really reinforcing, because how the eating disorder works on our brain is it actually starts to send signals that eating is bad. And we lose kind of that reward mechanism that reinforces eating. And then we already kind of talked about how it starts to wreak havoc on our gut. So we don't have those hunger and fullness signals happening appropriately. Our digestion is thrown off, so we're not really feeling like eating. And then that body image stuff starts to intensify. So being able to get that support beforehand is really important, and just kind of exploring with someone, why do I feel this way when I eat the chocolate? And what is contributing to me feeling a loss of control when I'm making certain food choices? And what is this level of distress about? And how could I make some shifts around this? Yeah, kind of, I think sometimes people feel like they need to have a full-blown eating disorder to do anything about it, and that disordered eating is just kind of this normal thing. And it kind of has become normal in the sense that it's common. And a lot of people's relationship with food is not intuitive. It's not coming from their body's desires. It's coming from all this external messaging. But especially if you have a family history of any mental health conditions or an eating disorder in particular, you have that increased vulnerability of that disordered eating kind of amplifying. And so taking those steps to be preventive there is important.
Thank you for sharing that, Kate. So what does it mean to have complete peace with food?
So making peace with food is one of the intuitive eating principles. So Dustin had mentioned earlier that I'm a certified intuitive eating counselor. And so I've done a lot of training on intuitive eating, which is a way of approaching food that comes from self-compassion. And it's about listening to your body's signals and being able to respond to those in a non-judgmental way. When we think about making complete peace with food, it's basically having that neutral stance around it, knowing that we can enjoy the foods that we like. If we don't have to have this sense of guilt or shame or this intense rumination around it, or feeling like we need to compensate, or, oh, that was just my cheat meal, or I'll do better tomorrow, or I'm so bad for eating that. It's just treating food as food. And we know different types of food provide different nutrients for our body. We're not going to get the same, vitamins and minerals from eating cashews as we are from eating strawberries, but that doesn't make us a better or worse person for choosing one or the other, because our bodies are really good at guiding us most of the time at what we need. And so if we're able to lean into that and not get caught up in dieting messaging, we're able to be in really good balance. But I think we've been taught for so long that we can't trust ourselves, and that if we make these different food choices, something horrible is going to happen, or that we have no self-control or lack self-discipline, or we're just doing everything wrong. We're not caring for ourselves. But it's actually all of this stress around what is okay to eat that's posing a lot of these problems. And so a lot of my work with clients is just identifying some of these barriers and figuring out, where is all this messaging coming from? And and what is the backing behind this? Because we know from nutrition research that everything is just, even a whack-a-mole with that. If we look at the history of dieting, it's just turning one food against another. And we, had the war on fat a while ago. And, there was times where protein was really low, or fears around different types of carbohydrates. And then it's like, well, okay, you can have all foods, but some of them are good and some of them are bad. And, having different combinations, or even things like a blood type diet, it's just always changing. We know that you just can't win in that type of situation. There's such this industry around dieting. So having that complete peace with food is just knowing that you can trust yourself and that there doesn't have to be any of these conditions around your eating. Because sometimes people will come to me and they'll be like, well, I feel totally fine about eating chocolate as long as it's the only time I eat chocolate in the whole week. And the more we kind of put these rules around things, the more we end up breaking them. I know for myself, like if I try to put a rule around, I'm going to only go out and buy coffee from Starbucks once a week, I end up buying it way more than if I had not put that rule. And well, sometimes we do need to have parameters in place for ourselves to keep our lives in balance. When it comes to food, and it's an essential of life. And so when we're trying to restrict that, it creates kind of this survivalistic mentality where then we overthrow that rule because we're worried about that state of deprivation. And so kind of my hope for clients is that, they don't have to fear that anymore, and that it doesn't have to be this big algorithm or game around their food choices. They can just listen and respond in a way that has that self-compassion.
Yeah, that makes sense. And as you were sharing that, it kind of made me think of this client I had, which kind of connects to a previous question. We were talking about the intersections of conditions, as I had this client that had diabetes and they had an eating disorder, and they were struggling to navigate, what does it mean to make peace with food when I'm scared of my blood sugar getting elevated?
Yeah. Good question. And it definitely adds some different complexities when we've got other things going on, especially something like diabetes that has a large influence from the foods that we eat. But I think something that is often forgotten is that things like blood sugar are impacted by dozens of factors, things like our stress levels, how much sleep we've gotten, our exercise, have a profound impact on blood sugar, but yet we tend to hyper focus on it all must be the food choices. And not to say that food doesn't have any impact on those things, but when that's the hyper focus, it increases the other factors that might be dysregulating blood sugar, because it's especially throwing that stress level off. I think it's, even someone with diabetes can have that sense of intuitive eating if they're listening to themselves, because, oftentimes if someone's blood sugar is starting to drop, they can feel those signals. If they respond to that in a way where they're going and getting that fast acting carbohydrate, they start to feel better. And if their blood sugar is high, they're often having symptoms of that as well. And it's different for everyone, but it might be things like headaches or irritability or fatigue, and being able to respond to those signals as well. Part of intuitive eating and making peace with food is knowing that sometimes when you eat something, it's not going to be perfect. It's not going to feel the best. And that's just part of being human. We know that sometimes when we eat something, our blood sugars might spike. That can be a choice that the person makes because they might really want to participate in eating that birthday cake at their niece's birthday party. That might be something that's really important to them. They might know within themselves that cake tends to spike that blood sugar. But then knowing that if they don't allow themselves that cake, they're much more likely to then potentially overeat on cake later. And then they've missed out on that opportunity for connection, then potentially disrupted their blood sugar as well. So, I definitely can appreciate that fear because especially in the medical community, there's so much emphasis on you must keep your blood sugar levels stable. If you don't, there's loads and loads of medical complications. You could lose your toes. I think it becomes quite scary for people. But I think it's really playing the tape out and seeing how if we don't allow ourselves these things that we're craving or that make us connected to life, we're ending up in the same place. We're under those high levels of stress, and that is so correlated with negative health outcomes. So even someone who has those co-occurring medical complications does need to work on making peace with food, and probably even more so because their body is in that more vulnerable state.
Definitely. And there's a couple huge takeaways that I just heard from that conversation, which is number one, like we can trust our bodies. Our bodies are so intelligent. They know exactly what to do with every macronutrient, micronutrient. A lot of times that ED voice in our head is telling us like, hey, we can't trust our bodies. But also another huge thing that I heard was when the stress of thinking and ruminating about the food and how that's impacting us. And I say that to clients all the time, us stressing out about the carbs, like that stress being generated is going to be causing way more damage than the bag of chips. And so being able to kind of zoom out like that and remind ourselves that we are a whole person. We want to look at it through every angle. And I think that's really brilliant what you said. But I also love that you mentioned the different fads that we have seen, even just in our lifetime too. But before our lifetime, fats were being demonized in the 80s. And then, now they're cool. And, we have to be low carb with Atkins. There's a lot of information. And I think, like you were saying, it's really overwhelming for people to kind of navigate through it and what is real, what is not. And I think there's a lot of research right now that's coming up around eating and how it's impacting our mental health. There's a lot of research regarding serotonin in the gut right now and how our diet can impact anxiety, depression, mental health overall. So I want to kind of ask you, what is like your stance on that? What role might that play for like risk of an eating disorder development?
Yeah. Like you mentioned, there's been such an interest in trying to eat for your brain and use nutrition as a strategy for improving our mental health. And I think there's a lot of good things that we can take from that. But I think because of how diet culture works and also just human nature wanting these quick fixes, it ends up creating more of this just disordered eating and anxiety around food. We have kids who are struggling with depression, being told they should never eat sugar again, and that's what's causing their mental health issues. And I think that's just scary and sad because there's not a food that's causing any of these mental health conditions, and there's not a single food that's going to fix them. That said, a lot of times when someone is struggling with their mental health, their nutrition is really, really off. And that can cause the symptoms of their mental health condition to be amplified. So, for example, if someone is struggling with anxiety, they might not feel much of an appetite. Our gut kind of gets all crunched up and we're preoccupied with other things. And the last thing we're even, contemplating is grabbing something to eat. And it might even like that thought of that might be nauseating. And so people can end up in really malnourished states because of that. And same if someone is feeling depressed, it might be hard to get out of bed and find anything to eat. Then when we combine that with some of this messaging about what the right foods to eat for those conditions are, it creates these additional barriers because someone might feel like, okay, I could get out of bed and go make myself, some top ramen. That would be quick and easy. But no, I can't have that because there's too much sodium or it's an ultra processed food. And so then they end up with no nutrition at all. Then it makes it harder for them to get nutrition the next day. Or we know if someone's not getting in enough nutrients or enough calories, any medications that they're taking are going to have much less of a benefit. And so they end up in this really vicious cycle. And then, kind of working just on that consistency with eating, spacing meals out throughout the day can be really helpful in terms of just bringing back some of those energy levels and creating kind of structure in the day, which sometimes is really missing for someone who is struggling with their mental health. There's kind of that element of how can we have more social eating and kind of break out of that isolation can be quite important thing to do for these individuals as well. But I think the more that we throw supplements and superfoods and avoid this, avoid that onto these individuals, we're just creating more stress and more anxiety. And I think it creates more stigma around mental illness as well. It's like, well, if you just didn't eat so much sugar and had more omega-3s, you would not have mental illness, when, well, certainly we do need some different nutrients to protect our brain. That's not the cause for these conditions. And I think it just can make people feel bad about themselves and limit access to care. So yeah, I think it definitely can, increase the risk of eating disorders as well, because, we know that most eating disorders have some element of restriction in there. And so the more that we are setting people up to be restricting in those situations, the higher chance that someone who's already vulnerable for mental health conditions, and then they've got this level of deprivation put upon them, there is that really high crossover. And so putting things in place to try to change that stance and to help avoid that is important.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Kate. What are some out-of-the-box strategies you have used to help clients move forward in their wellness journey?
Yeah. So this is always a fun part of working with clients is, trying what no one has tried before, or looking at things from a new perspective and trying something new to get out of those stuck spots. So something that I've done with a client recently, this client has an eating disorder, but also really struggles with OCD. And so making food decisions has been really, really difficult because everything needs to fit. And if it doesn't fit, then it doesn't feel right. And it feels like she can't eat it. And so I actually created these fun spinning wheels where, like, the day before she goes through and she spins a wheel for each eating time, and it lands on a meal or snack, and that's what she has for the day. So that way it kind of removes that decision making barrier. She can kind of blame it on the wheel, and it still allows her to have good variety and challenge this rigid pattern making she was doing. So that's been a really cool thing to see her be able to thrive with that. I think a lot of times people would think, well, she's not really making the decision for herself, and, is that just a Band-Aid? But I think knowing that a lot of these conditions are somewhat chronic, and we need to find tools that are going to allow the person to feel a bit more comfortable with eating while having that good variety, even if it feels, it doesn't feel like it's 100%. So I think that's been a really cool thing to do, even though this one can feel like a bit elementary as well. I think always the use of like sticker charts or like fun little rewards can be a good motivator for people, even if they're adults. I think sometimes when we're thinking about our relationship with food, it's always so negative. We're never doing anything right, or we are still struggling with this or with that. And to be able to have those little wins, something to kind of motivate you for the end of the week, I think can be quite a fun thing to do as well. Like I said earlier, like meeting people where they're at, and knowing that initially when someone is struggling with disordered eating, there's usually a level of malnutrition. And so wanting to correct that. So I've had clients before where like their only safe food was avocado. And we made a whole meal plan kind of based off of avocados. Well, again, that's not the most balanced thing in the world. There's other nutrients that we need to focus on down the track. Being able to be like, all right, like let's start with where we are. And we had a lot of different avocado-based recipes that we started with. But yeah, I think not being afraid to try something that is like doesn't fit the mold, or doesn't fit like, okay, this is perfect nutrition, because no one has perfect nutrition, and we want to be moving people forward.
I definitely hear the common theme there is meeting your client where they're at, wherever they are in their journey. It sounds like is really, really important strategy for our listeners that maybe don't have an eating disorder, but maybe they have a little bit of like a disordered relationship with food that they're just now starting to notice, whether it be a little bit of all or nothing thinking, or maybe they're starting to feel a little bit of shame and guilt around certain foods, or noticing that they're starting to develop a little bit of food rules, let's say. what are some just like really approachable tips or takeaways would you like for those people to maybe walk away with?
Yeah, good question. So something I always like to talk to clients about, and that's whether they have an eating disorder or not, is something called the habituation effect. What the habituation effect is, when we have something regularly, it loses its special meaning. So you might really enjoy, I don't know, going on a trip to Spain, and it might be like this most magical trip and you're really looking forward to it and you make all these great memories. But if you went to Spain every single day, it wouldn't have that same thing. It would just be like, all right, I'm going to the next town over. And so the same thing applies with our relationship with food. So if we put something like chocolate on a pedestal and have it be this thing that it's like so special, we can only have it on certain occasions, it's kind of got this taboo, like it's really not good for me, I need to be careful, it's got these, special ingredients, then we're much, much more likely to have this all or nothing relationship with it, where we are avoiding the chocolate and then we are overindulging on the chocolate to the point of feeling really sick or uncomfortable. And so I often talk to people about trying to reintroduce these foods, which sometimes can feel like the last thing they feel like is safe to do because they're worried about a lack of control or their ability to keep things in moderation if they start. I don't want to open that Pandora's box. However, when they keep going down that track, oftentimes people find that they end up overcompensating and having way more of that food than they would have wanted. So my tips are always just to, if we use chocolate as an example, like try to incorporate that in a regular way in your life. If your body knows and your mind knows that you're going to get that thing regularly, it loses that power, So if you were to have like some chocolate with your lunch every single day or several times a week, the likelihood when chocolate comes around in the office or you're home alone in the evening and you see that chocolate bar there, you may decide to have it, but you'll be more in control around it versus if it is that all or nothing, it feels very out of control, which no one likes that feeling. And, just creating those safe spaces for yourself to eat food in a way that feels more comfortable, more regulated, I think is really important for everyone.
I think it's huge to be able to kind of put a finger on it. I've never heard about it called you said habituation effect?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely talk to clients about like once we put something on a pedestal, we're going to ruminate on it, right? We're going to think about it. We're going to want the cookie more because we can't have it. So I love that you mentioned that. That's a huge takeaway. And I think in general, some of the just beautiful highlights of this real honest conversation for me was really breaking down the difference between disordered eating and eating disorders, being able to identify that for our listeners, but also that we can make peace with food and that it is possible to release that shame and to listen to our bodies, to trust our bodies and allowing all foods in. I think that we had some beautiful, honest takeaways from this conversation. And thank you so much, Kate. We are so grateful for you to just take the time and share your expertise with us.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been such a pleasure getting to chat with you both and being able to talk about this topic. It's one of my biggest passions, so I appreciate you guys allowing me to share with you.
Definitely. And thank you everyone for tuning in to Discovering the Wellness Formula. If today's episode sparked something for you, we would love for you to share it, leave a review, or follow along for more real conversations that go beyond the surface of wellness. And for our listeners that are registered dietitians, if you enjoyed this episode, please take the time to listen to the incredible CEU presentation that Kate put together on hormones and eating disorders. The link is included in our episode description. Until next time, listeners, please take care of yourselves and remember that real wellness starts from within. Our podcast, Discovering the Wellness Formula, dives into all domains of health, whether it's discussing mental health strategies, nutrition tips, fitness approaches, or exploring how relationships and personal growth contribute to our overall well-being. We aim to make wellness more accessible and inclusive for everyone.